Good afternoon. This is Guy Mansetto with PartsSource. Apologize about the technical difficulties. We weren't able to activate the GoToWebinar, so we'll be beginning here shortly. Mara, do we have you online?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to our executive webcast series. My name is Guy Mansetto. I'm a Senior Vice President here at PartsSource, and today's presentation is entitled Redefining the Clinical Engineering Supply Chain Strategy, presented by Mara, Senior Director of Client Solutions here at PartsSource. Before joining PartsSource, Mara had direct oversight of centralized operations for Allina Health, a system of over 11 hospitals and over 90 clinics. And we're delighted now to have her on the team at PartsSource as the Senior Director of Client Solutions, who's responsible for leading the newly branded Client Solutions team here at PartsSource. Her leadership is critical to our team's success as she works closely with leaders in healthcare technology management to design and launch programs to create procurement efficiencies with the goal of saving healthcare organizations time, money, and ultimately improving patient care. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. Today's presentation will last approximately 30 minutes, and there'll be available time at the end for Q&A. And we encourage you to use the electronic section of the GoToWebinar controls for entering your questions throughout the session. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mara.
All right. Well, thank you, Guy. Thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to speak a bit on a very important subject, which is redefining the clinical engineering supply chain. I think that now more than ever, our industry of clinical engineering, or HTM, has the opportunity to have a significant impact on lowering healthcare costs and improving patient outcomes in our organizations. So to set the context for our discussion today, I wanted to touch briefly on why this is such a vital topic right now. It's pretty apparent from the news that healthcare is an industry that's in crisis, and hospitals nationwide continue to face even greater challenges to contain cost, and this will continue to happen over the coming years. And as evidenced by the information on this slide, industry trends are not really going in the right direction, and expenses continued to rise over the course of last year in 2017, while patient admissions declined. So this resulted in net operating revenue in the negative digits for a lot of the large players in the hospital market, notably here, HCA, CHS, and Tenet. The bottom line, I think, is that stress continues to be on both improving the quality of healthcare while controlling and, in many cases, if not all cases, trying to decrease cost. And there seems to just be still a lot of unknowns in regards to how healthcare reform will play out. But regardless, we know that the pressures to reduce cost and increase quality are only going to continue to increase. And I think one interesting statistic to look at is that healthcare itself is close to approaching 20% of the U.S. economy during a time when Medicare is projected to reach insolvency by 2029. So that's really not a great scenario by any means. And the other trend that's interesting that's been identified recently is that healthcare supply chain costs are predicted to surpass labor as the #1 source of expense to hospitals by 2020. So I think if there's a silver lining here, the good news is that many hospital supply chain groups are working to identify areas for cost containment and opportunities for streamlining operations, and that this is really an area that clinical engineering, or HTM, can definitely play a role in. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I think really just the trend towards streamlining and optimizing hospital supply chain affords clinical engineering departments a unique role to really have a direct impact on leading the change towards substantial savings and high quality outcomes. The question really becomes then, where can clinical engineering groups focus their energies and efforts most effectively? In essence, where can we have the biggest bang for our buck? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So for the rest of our time together this afternoon, I'm going to spend some time focusing on 3 areas of opportunity. And this is really going to be centered around people, process, and technology. And all 3 of those are essential to achieving the objectives that I think every one of our clinical engineering groups wants to achieve. And that's really, how can we save our organizations money? How can we be more productive with our time? How can we make sure that we have quality outcomes? And ultimately, how do we communicate all of that and showcase the value that our clinical engineering groups bring to any organization? So the first item that we're going to touch on today is people. You know, in the clinical engineering industry, our largest asset is our people. Without the proper resources, we wouldn't be able to respond when equipment is down and impacting patient care. We couldn't perform vital preventive maintenance to ensure smooth functioning equipment. And I think when you look at many hospital organizations, the clinical engineering group technicians, managers, directors, they're often trusted advisors for everyone from the frontline nursing group to the CFO and CEO of an organization. Clinical engineering gives input on important capital purchases, technical interfaces, and lots of other special equipment projects. So when you consider the wide variety of responsibilities that clinical engineering groups have, the question really has to be, you know, where are we spending a lot of time for little value? And once we start asking this question, we can narrow down activities that suck up time and energy but don't provide the results that we want or need. And, you know, just to share some of my own background, when I've completed this exercise in the past at other healthcare provider organizations, the answers usually consist of anything not centered around the core competency of providing actual service. So some examples of things that take a lot of time and energy but don't provide a lot of value would be managing service contracts, reconciling invoices and paperwork, sourcing parts. These are a few specific examples that I've run across in the past. And I think that there's a lot of ways to leverage people in the pursuit of lowering supply chain costs. One of these areas that I wanted to touch on today is the importance of developing strong relationships with your supply chain team, your finance group, and other internal groups to ensure that you have a seat at the table, particularly as it goes on with discussions on capital purchases. You know, clinical engineering advice on the cost of service for certain types of equipment and vendors, looking at the inclusion of in-house training in a capital purchase, the negotiation of new types of service contracts that are tailored to your needs. These are a few areas of opportunity that you can work with other groups in your internal organization to achieve. You can also work with these internal groups to identify other companies to create strategic partnerships with. And in particular, you can focus on ones that have large supply chains where you can add your purchasing volume to theirs and receive the benefits of their strong buying power. I think that the more strategic you can be in identifying the types of equipment you can bring in-house, the better you can leverage your resources and also provide your staff with new opportunities for growth and advancement, all while saving the organization money and often providing faster uptime than any OEM or third-party service provider really could. So we wanted to give a couple examples how in a financial environment where adding resources can be really difficult, how do we focus on opportunities to increase productivity and free up time to take on other special projects, all of the things that as a clinical engineering industry we're being asked to tackle right now: equipment installation projects, device cybersecurity, interoperability implementations, and more. You know, all of these things are on the minds of clinical engineering groups and how we're going to free up time to take these projects on. I wanted to give the example of a couple organizations that have, through some strategic partnerships, been able to do this. One of these is New York Presbyterian. They put some processes in place in terms of their parts procurement through a program with PartsSource, where they really focused on improving the productivity of their technical staff. Through mapping out their current process and moving to a more desired state, they were able to reduce their total parts procurement to pay time by 65% per order and create a 75% reduction in actual order processing time. Another example is at Mayo Clinic, where they start to finish, for sourcing and procuring parts and paying for it on the back end, we're spending 89 minutes per order, and we're able to automate it down to a process of 4 minutes per order, which really equated system-wide for them to saving 31 hours per day. So these additional time savings are just time back in the technician's pockets to be able to go out and to perform service, which is ultimately the goal. So the second area that I wanted to touch on today is process. When we talk about process, one of the key questions to ask yourself is, who are our high spend vendors and what are our quality rates that we're getting with that service, with that product? Typically, the largest part of any clinical engineering budget is service contracts. This line item in your budget can account for anywhere between 40 to 75% of the total expense that clinical engineering incurs. Parts procurement is another large bucket of expense, and the two, service contracts and parts procurement, are closely related, as the more service contracts you cancel and bring in-house, the higher your parts spend will rise. So, answering the question of what your quality rates are and what they should be is a bit more tricky, as most clinical engineering departments don't typically have means to track this information. Once you've narrowed down who your high spend vendors are, it's easier to develop a strategy for cost containment. And what this could mean is a few things. It could look like going back and renegotiating supplier contracts. It could look like finding alternative options that maintain quality at a lower price point. And one major consideration that you can look at is cutting cost out of your supply chain by doing vendor consolidation. When you take a step back and you look at the cost of managing hundreds or even thousands of different vendors, all with different buying, dispatching, and invoicing processes, the cost of that to the organization can be extremely high. Looking for companies that can provide a wide scope of services and/or suppliers for your organization, and better yet, looking for companies that have certified quality processes in place and can give you access to industry benchmarking, is really key. In the industry, I've found that very few clinical engineering groups have the bandwidth or the resources to put a supplier vetting process in place to ensure that service and parts that are being provided are of high quality. So partnering with an organization that can do that is one way to achieve that metric. So, taking a hard look at the processes that you have in place for sourcing service and parts, since those are the two biggest line items in your budget, and looking for opportunities to consolidate suppliers can really help you achieve better pricing and better outcomes. Here's a couple examples of organizations that form strategic partnerships with PartsSource, for example, and that really helped them achieve some excellent outcomes in these areas of vendor consolidation, meeting quality metrics, and realizing hard cost savings on service. The first example being Allina Health. They were able to consolidate over 450 different suppliers that they were using for parts procurement, and also they were able to set a baseline and start tracking what their quality acceptance rate was. So they were provided visibility to what parts were dead on arrival, what parts didn't meet quality metrics, what parts got returned to the supplier because they were inaccurately shipped or inaccurately ordered. And they're currently maintaining a 98.1% quality acceptance rate. The other example that I wanted to give is with Mayo Clinic. They were able to take a look at a service contract that they had for infusion pumps, and they noticed that by canceling that and moving that to a vetted depot repair provider, they could actually save the organization over $400,000 annually. So that seems like a pretty much a no-brainer for them. The last area that we're going to touch on today is technology. By recognizing opportunities to use technology effectively, clinical engineering departments can automate many processes that are currently manual, such as parts ordering, service dispatching, requisitions in your ERP system, and invoice payment and reconciliation on the background. I think the other area that technology has a large impact on is reporting and data analytics. I think we all strive to create SOPs or standard operating procedures and enforce consistent data entry into our CMMS or work order system. And the more that we can do this, the more solid a foundation we have for reporting and analytics. Another way that we can get access to this data is to partner with companies that have access to industry-wide data, allowing us to set better internal metrics against industry benchmarks. So tracking and reporting on your spend, particularly as it pertains to service and parts, will better allow you to recognize spending patterns and make changes to save money. So a couple examples that I'll just call out are that when you're reviewing service spend, you can look for, calling out, for instance, vendor service after hours where it might not have been needed and extra expense was incurred because of that. You can look at standardizing where OEM replacement parts can be purchased at a substantially less cost than the OEM original parts. And you can set some expectations for ordering and purchasing and service behaviors based off of those data trends. So by tracking and reporting all the work that your department is doing to save the organization both money and time, this really gives you also a great story to go back and share with leaders in the organization about the value that clinical engineering provides each and every day. So the last couple examples I wanted to give you are really around automation and technology. This can be an area where you can really provide meaningful productivity savings, freeing up that time as we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, as well as having better access to data and analytics to optimize your operations. The first example that I wanted to give is where the technology platform that PartsSource provides to Texas Health Resources had a significant impact on their workflow. They were actually able to eliminate the double entry that was happening with their parts entry through their CMMS work order system. We did an integration with the parts procurement module, and they were able to achieve a $45 reduction in cost per order. The second example I wanted to give is where CHS was able to both lower their costs and get insights into data analytics that they didn't have previously. Overall, they were realizing a 26% savings on their parts by moving to a technology platform for ordering, and they also were able to put an improved parts procurement governance process in place by reviewing the analytics on a regular basis and making purchasing decisions based off of that data that they were reviewing. So I think in closing, there's really just three things, I'd like you to take away from this presentation. First of all, we're just living in a time where healthcare is really getting crunched to provide much better value to our patients, and clinical engineering can contribute significantly to this by focusing on where we can achieve hard and soft cost savings for the organization by streamlining our supply chain process. Second, that the two areas that we can really focus on are eliminating service contracts and consolidating suppliers. And these are two avenues that we can achieve the greatest positive impact on the clinical engineering supply chain. And then three, that it's really important to leverage all three: people, process, and technology, and to communicate that effectively once you've made those changes and had those results, because as we all know, if we don't communicate it out, then it didn't happen. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today to discuss this very important topic of redefining your clinical engineering supply chain.
Great, thank you, Mara. That was very interesting, and I think you hit on a number of different points around, really the challenges of organizations to automate and use tools, people, process, and technology to be more efficient and drive better, more confident decisions, and look at clinical availability in a new light, and use the clinical engineering platform as a way to reduce variance and drive better outcomes for their clinicians and the patients and populations they serve. So very interesting, and thank you so much for your time on describing some of the examples in your presentation. So with that, I would encourage everyone who's watching the webinar to use the Q&A section of the GoToMeeting and we'll begin to take questions for Mara. One of the questions that came in had to do with vendor consolidation. The question is, vendor consolidation can be and is a very big project. How best, or what's your best recommendation in how you would approach that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it can be overwhelming to approach something like vendor consolidation. I mean, clinical engineering groups actually have way more vendors than one would think, especially when it comes to parts and service as well. So I think the first step is really to know, who do you spend money with and how many vendors does that comprise? So if you can pull that data to have a better understanding of that, then that gives you a baseline to start working from. And once you know who you spend money with and how many vendors that is, then you can start identifying where you are utilizing multiple vendors for purchasing the same product or service, and where you're receiving the lower price point with the high quality that you want. Because very often, I think when we start reviewing that data, we see that we actually buy the same product from multiple vendors, and that's not really necessary. So you can start to set some of those buying behaviors with your staff or with each other to ensure that you are slimming down the number of vendors you're utilizing, and you're also getting the best price point for that product. Typically, the largest percentage of vendors will be parts or material spend related, so that can be a really good place to start the process of looking at vendor consolidation, to focus on your parts vendors. And once you do that, you can start to consolidate spend under a set of preferred vendors, or you can partner with an organization like PartsSource that does the work of managing that supply chain process for you. There's really a couple different avenues you can take.
Great, thank you. Another question we had that came in was regarding, well, let me just read the question. What steps would you take to determine where an in-house equipment service strategy would make sense?
Yeah, that's definitely a big question as well. I think there's a couple different ways to look at that. One way to look at it is to look at what critical equipment you have, where having on-site resources to get the equipment back up and running faster would decrease downtime for patients and also minimize any lost revenue for the organization. So that can be one way to kind of attack like where you should focus your energy first, is on that critical equipment. I think you can also look at it from the perspective of contract spend. Really look at identifying what are your largest spend vendors and what are the modalities of equipment that are represented in that spend. And then doing the work to, as a best practice, develop a service contract analysis template that can be used to evaluate different service strategies is probably the best bet. And the different service strategies you can look at are, what are the different types of OEM or third-party service contracts that are out there? What are your time and material options? And then ultimately, what are your in-house service options? And when you do that side-by-side comparison, you'll probably need to get detailed information from your work order system and from the vendor. And then depending on what training options are available out there in the market, whether it's direct from the OEM or another third party, you need to investigate that. And then you also need to know where you can purchase parts from and at what cost. I think the last factor it's important to look at is really what are the technical resources that you'll need to dedicate to that equipment. So performing that service analysis will give you justification if additional headcount is needed. That's going to save the organization money. And lastly, I'll just mention, if you don't have visibility to how many PMs are performed on that piece of equipment, how long it takes, the average repair time and frequency, often the OEM can give you this information. Sometimes you really have to bug them for it, but you can get it. And as contracts come up for renewal or expiration, that's really a good time to start performing this analysis to determine whether to move that service in-house. So I think, to recap, you can look at critical equipment, you can look from the perspective of what do you spend the most money on, and you can also look at what's coming up for renewal or expiration in terms of contracts.
Okay, very good. Just a reminder for folks on the phone, if you do have questions, use the Q&A section of the GoToWebinar controls. We do have a few more questions we've been going through. There are some vendors that won't ship unless they have a minimum dollar amount on the order. Sometimes that will present some timely delivery issues. How typically would you recommend healthcare organizations, the hospitals, manage that challenge in terms of shipping minimums and requirements on the parts supplier?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue. I think from an internal perspective, a lot of the work order systems and CMMS systems that are out there, they have vendor profiles that you can set up for parts and materials, and a lot of them do have the ability to track minimum thresholds, whether it's a quantity or a dollar amount threshold, and it will give you a warning pop-up when you are, trying to order something that's under the minimum. That's really the only way I can see it being managed from an internal perspective, unless you have some kind of centralized buyer that has responsibility for grouping orders and trying to somehow manage that process manually. If you use systems like PartsSource, that information is housed in the eParts Finder platform, so that when you go to actually put an order in for something, it will automatically give you a pop-up message if there is a vendor minimum.
Thank you. The next question, how can PartsSource specifically help with a distributed parts or consolidated parts strategy? Do you have tools that will help evaluate business benefits? This particular audience participant was asking specifically about programs within PartsSource to help organizations like the ones you've presented around different programs or new programs that we have in place here that can help organizations.
Sure. Definitely. We definitely have programs that can partner with organizations to really take a look and do a lot of this consultative process that I was just talking about in terms of looking at service contracts, determining what makes sense to try to take in-house, where is the best place to get those parts from. We can do a lot of that work with you and for you, and take the heavy lifting on that. We have a pretty comprehensive program that we do with enterprise systems, where we really partner with them to figure out what the best strategy would be around that type of work, and then work to execute on that together. We're able to provide a list of all the different modalities that we can support from a parts perspective, and we can match that up with your asset inventory list to tell you exactly what we'd be able to support and at what price point. So definitely that's something that PartsSource can provide.
Great. Thank you, Mara. The next question, when you're evaluating or deciding on a parts partner, what key characteristics would you recommend our listeners prioritize?
Well, I went through this process several years ago when I was working for Allina Health, as Guy mentioned, and I looked at a few different factors. One was that vendor consolidation piece was really key for me, so I was looking for a partner that could provide the most parts. So I was looking for a partner that could provide both general biomed parts and imaging parts, so that I didn't have to go to two separate places and have two separate processes for that. So that's one factor I looked at. A second was quality was very important. So I was looking for a vendor that was ISO certified, that had a proven quality process and vendor vetting process in place, and could show me that they did audits with the vendors and that they tracked the quality metrics and were able to report on that, and that they only utilized vendors that met those quality initiatives they had. So that was something else I was really looking for. And ultimately, it also came down to price. So it was important to me that I not spend more and preferably spend less than what I was spending. So that was definitely a factor as well. So I would say those were really the three factors that I looked at in choosing a parts partner. I think that the last thing I would just mention is ease of process. Nobody wants to institute a process that's going to create more time or take more time to carry out. Preferably, it's going to take less. So the technology platform, the integrations, and the different functionality that a vendor can provide around that, I think that's really essential to look at as well. You always want the process to be easier so that everybody enjoys using it and sees the value in it.
Very helpful. This next question I'll read to you, but I also would love to get your feedback on the best practices here. The question is a specific question to PartsSource, but around what CMMS systems or ERP systems do we integrate with? I would also add to that, aside from just naming some of the big integrations that we have, what's important, would you say, what are the key areas of integration that you feel would be helpful for clinical engineering departments to have available to them, going forward?
Sure. Well, now you're just testing my memory as off the top of my head as to who PartsSource integrates with. But in terms of ERP systems, we have integrations with all the large ERP systems, McKesson, Lawson, PeopleSoft. We'll be in the process of putting one through with Oracle as well. So I think those are all the ERP systems, and that's really to create that process on the back end that we don't think about a lot in terms of the invoicing component of things and the order processing for requisitions that go through the ERP system. So that can create a really seamless process to have an integration with your ERP system, and it actually takes time out of the process for your AP department as well and your finance department, which they typically really, really love. So that can be a huge win for an organization. In terms of CMMS, we have integrations with AIMS, Phoenix Data Systems, TMS. We have a punch out in place with Mainspring, and we have several others that are also under development right now with some of the other major CMMS players in the market. So, but if anyone has specific questions, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to have a conversation on that. I think, from my perspective, in terms of what creates the best or the most value for a clinical engineering organization is if you can automate both the actual purchasing process in terms of submitting the order, and there can be information flowing back between your CMMS and the PartsSource website, ePartsFinder. Then if that information can flow back into your CMMS, then it means that parts get applied to work orders and such. That is the ultimate goal. And then, like I said, if information in terms of PO numbers and invoicing information can flow back through the ERP, that's also the ultimate goal.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mara. This has been a fabulous, most interesting session. We usually end these with one question. I'll ask it in a second, but obviously, if you are able to simplify and optimize procurement, you can reduce cost and spend and accelerate uptime, but also use that data and insights to help provide better predictability and measure outcomes and measure ideally quality and effectiveness of the parts you're procuring, and raising and elevating the clinical engineering discipline within supply chain. And it's exciting to see and hear a number of the examples that you provided. So my last question is, if you had a crystal ball, what would your thoughts be around what's going to happen within the healthcare supply chain space here in the next year or two, and what's going to increasingly be important as we wrap up our webcast?
Oh, wow, that's a big question, Guy. I think a lot of the things we touched on today, I think that we're continue to have this pressure for cost containment, and we're going to have to come up with new and creative solutions to that. I think that the things we touched on today in terms of vendor consolidation, I mean, you're seeing it even at a healthcare industry-wide level in terms of, health system mergers. Everything is getting a bit bigger so that you can leverage the buying power of those organizations at a much, higher level. And then, in terms of vendor consolidation, just making the process easier so that you're not sucking up a bunch of time with unnecessary work or manual work. And I think technology is going to play a huge role in this. As a company, I think PartsSource is going to continue to invest in technology so that we can provide our customers, a seamless process to really manage their supply chain team with. So that's what I see happening in the next couple of years, is a continued focus on reductions in cost, and that's going to be through automation and technology.
Well, you did well, Mara. Thank you so much for your time today and the very insightful information you provided. This webcast is recorded and will be distributed. Again, I apologize for folks who had a little bit of a hard time getting on. Appreciate the patience being able to get into the webinar. Hopefully it was worth your time to listen to where we're at and learn more about how redefining clinical engineering and supply chain strategies can be put in place. So with that, the webcast has ended. Thank you all for attending and have a fantastic day.